It happened on a quiet afternoon in New York City, sunlight coming through my small living room window while my son stood in front of me, arms crossed, acting like he owned the place. My knees hurt, my back hurt, but my mind was clear. He told me I was confused, that the house was basically his now, and that I should stop worrying about old papers. I just watched him, calm, because I knew something he didn't. This story is about those papers. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I still remember the moment clearly because it was the kind of moment that changes everything inside a person. I was sitting in my small living room, sorting through old bills and letters, trying to make sense of the rising costs and shrinking savings. My son stood in front of me with a boldness I had not seen before. His face showed impatience, and his voice carried the tone of someone who believed he had power over me. He dismissed my concerns with a simple shrug, acting as if my words held no weight. When I tried to talk to him about the house, he looked at me like I was speaking nonsense. He said he did not know what I meant, brushing me off as if my understanding of my own property was somehow wrong. In that moment, something inside me shifted because I suddenly saw a version of my son I had ignored for too long. It was a mix of arrogance, entitlement, and confidence in his assumption that I had no control over anything anymore. As he stood there, pretending he had no idea what I was talking about, I felt years of quiet sacrifices rise up inside my chest. I had spent decades building a life inside that home. I had worked extra shifts, saved every dollar, gone without vacations, and skipped things I wanted so that my children could have stability. That house represented security, memory, and the work of a lifetime. Yet my son acted as though my connection to it meant nothing. He behaved like the property was already his, like I had no rights or say in anything. It was shocking to see how quickly he dismissed me. The denial in his voice was sharp and careless. It was not confusion. It was an attempt to erase my ownership and my authority. When he said he didn't know what I meant, I realized he believed I had no proof of anything. He believed I had no strength left to challenge him. He believed I would simply accept his version of the truth. His words were a clear attempt to push me into a corner. They were meant to make me doubt myself or feel powerless. But instead of weakening me, they brought an old fire back into my chest, one I had almost forgotten. For too long, I had allowed small, disrespectful actions to pass. I let comments slide. I let decisions be made without my full consent. I stayed quiet because I thought keeping peace was better than speaking up. But now, as he stood there with that dismissive look, everything inside me awakened with a sharp clarity. I realized that this moment was not just about a misunderstanding. It was the final sign of a pattern that had been growing for years. It was the moment that exposed the truth about how he viewed me. He saw me as someone he could ignore, someone who no longer had control, someone who would never fight back. The shock was real, but so was the clarity. In that moment, I saw exactly what kind of battle I was walking into. I understood that my son was not simply mistaken. He was preparing to take advantage of me. His behavior showed me something else too. He genuinely believed I had no protection. He assumed I had not taken any steps to secure what belonged to me. He assumed I was still the same mother who handed over resources, time, and energy without question. But he did not know the truth. Months earlier, I had taken steps he knew nothing about. I had prepared for the unexpected, even if I didn't fully understand why. I had signed property papers, consulted professionals, and quietly placed things in order. I had done this because age teaches you that preparation is the only shield you truly control. He had no idea that while he pretended to hold power, I held every legal document that proved otherwise. The shock of hearing my own son deny something so simple and real cut deep. But it also made me see that his ignorance worked in my favor. His arrogance blinded him. He believed he could manipulate me into handing over rights without resistance. He believed he could shift the situation in his direction by acting confused. But all he did was show me that he had no clue about the truth. Every second he acted dismissive was another second he revealed his weakness. He had no idea I already protected myself. As he turned away with an air of victory, I sat there in silence, processing everything. The shock was still fresh, but beneath it, a steady strength began to form. I knew then that this confrontation would not end in his favor. He believed he held control, but he was wrong. I had already written my signature on documents that secured everything. I had already taken steps he could not undo. And this moment, this shocking dismissal, only confirmed that it was time to let the truth unfold at the right moment. I was no longer afraid. I was awake, aware, and prepared. When he stood there pretending not to know what I was talking about, something inside me shifted. It was not anger, not shock, not even disappointment anymore. It was a slow, cold understanding. I had spent years trying to explain myself to this boy, trying to soften my words, trying to make him see reason. But at that moment, watching him pretend to be confused, I realized I no longer needed his understanding. I didn't need his approval, his apology, or his concern. He stood in front of me with that careless look he always carried, the one that said he believed he could talk his way out of anything. That expression had worked on many people in his life, but it wasn't going to work on me. Not anymore. So I just gave him a small smile, a quiet, controlled smile, the kind that made him blink with uncertainty because he didn't know how to respond to it. I didn't rush to explain anything. I didn't ask him to listen. I didn't remind him of the things he had said or the promises he had made. I just watched him stand there, confident in his own ignorance, believing he had the upper hand. It was almost impressive, in a way, how easily he could lie to himself. He really thought he had more power than he did. He really thought I was too old, too soft, too slow to protect what belonged to me. Inside, however, I felt calm. I had already prepared for this moment long before it came. I had already accepted the fact that he had drifted away from the values he was raised with. I had already seen the signs of his entitlement. Every small argument, every disrespectful shrug, every time he treated me like an obstacle rather than a parent had led me to this point. So when he looked at me and acted like he didn't know what property papers I was referring to, I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel shocked. I had expected this. It was simply the final proof I needed of what he had become. I stood there, letting silence sit between us, and in that silence, I could almost see the gears turning in his head. He was waiting for me to panic. He was waiting for me to raise my voice, or explain myself, or defend my words. He expected the version of me who still believed he meant well. He expected the mother who used to forgive him too easily. What he didn't expect was the woman I had become because of him, a woman who learned to protect herself, to prepare quietly, and to act without asking for permission. My smile did something to him, even if he didn't admit it. His posture shifted slightly, just enough for me to catch it. His eyes flicked away for half a second, just enough to show a crack in his confidence. He wasn't used to silence. He wasn't used to me holding my ground. He wasn't used to the possibility that I might know something he didn't. That alone was enough reason for me to keep smiling. He kept talking, trying to explain things I didn't ask about, trying to shift blame, trying to make himself look innocent, but I barely heard his words. I was watching the way he moved, the way he fidgeted, the way his voice trembled for just a moment. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to correct him. I didn't need to justify anything. He already knew deep down that something was wrong. He could feel it, and that uneasiness was enough. I had the signed property papers safely stored, legally protected, and ready to reveal when the moment was right. I didn't need to show them yet. I didn't need to defend their existence. I didn't need to warn him. I just needed to let him continue underestimating me, because that was the biggest mistake he could make. When someone believes you are powerless, they leave their guard wide open. They reveal everything without knowing. They make assumptions that eventually destroy them. So I looked at him with that same small smile, letting him talk, letting him pretend, letting him think he was still in control. Meanwhile, I held the truth inside me like a weapon wrapped in silk. I didn't have to lift it yet. I didn't have to strike. I simply had to wait, hold my ground, and let the right moment come on its own. And it would come, because people like him always push too far. They always believe they can get away with one more lie, one more demand, one more act of entitlement. They never think about the moment when someone finally stops letting them win. They never imagine that the quiet ones, the patient ones, are the ones with the sharpest memory and the strongest will. So I smiled, calm, quiet, and steady, letting him talk himself deeper into a hole he didn't even know he was standing in. Because I knew exactly what papers I had signed. And I knew, sooner or later, he would learn too. When I think back on the history of that property, it is impossible to separate the land from the years of effort I put into building a stable life for my family. The house was not simply a place with walls and a roof. It was the result of decades of long work days, saved dollars, sacrifices, and choices that shaped the entire direction of my life. I did not grow up with wealth, and everything I owned came from slow progress, careful planning, and saying no to things I wanted so my family could have what they needed. The house was the biggest symbol of that. I bought it at a time when interest rates were high, my husband was sick, and money was tight. Even then, I refused to give it up or borrow more than I could repay. I took extra shifts, sold things I loved, and learned how to stretch every dollar. The house became more than real estate. It became a source of pride and security. It was the place where my children grew up, where birthdays were celebrated, where holidays brought everyone together, and where I thought we all learned the meaning of stability and responsibility. My son especially benefited from that home. He had his own room, his own space, and meals ready even when I was exhausted from work. He had a place to come back to after mistakes, after breakups, and after losing jobs. I never charged him rent. I never asked him for help with bills. Everything I did came from a belief that a mother's job was to carry her children until they learned to walk alone. But slowly, over the years, the sense of appreciation and gratitude I expected never arrived. Instead, entitlement grew like a weed. Whenever I made decisions about renovations or repairs, he brushed me off. He acted like the place belonged to him. If I mentioned the property taxes or insurance, he would ignore me. If I talked about saving for emergencies, he rolled his eyes. I began to notice that he walked around the house with a careless attitude, treating it like a thing he would someday receive automatically. He never asked what I wanted. He assumed I was simply holding his future for him. The turning point came when my husband passed away. I thought my son would understand the emotional weight the house carried for me. Instead, he became even more bold and dismissive. He treated the house like an item on a list that he would claim someday. He started inviting friends over without asking. He talked about knocking down walls or renting out rooms without consulting me. When I reminded him it was my property, his response was always the same: shrugs, silent stares, or comments that I should stop acting dramatic. What he never knew was that around that time, I began quietly protecting myself. I saw the signs early. I saw how he spoke to people about the house as if it were already his. I saw him show visitors around like he was giving them a tour of a place he owned. I observed how his girlfriend encouraged his attitude, making small remarks about how one day she would change the decor or one day they would remodel the kitchen. Those comments stayed in my mind, not because they were bold, but because of what they revealed. My own son had convinced himself that my home was merely a waiting room until he inherited it. The more I watched, the more I understood that entitlement was not an attitude that would fade with time. It would grow, it would take, it would eventually push me out of my own life if I allowed it. That was when I began meeting with a lawyer, quietly, calmly, without saying a word to anyone. I explained the full history of the house, how I paid every bill, how I maintained everything, and how no one else had put in a single dollar. My lawyer listened, reviewed the documents, and made one thing clear: the property was entirely mine, and I had the full legal right to secure it permanently. Those documents I signed were not just papers, they were protection. They were a line between my years of sacrifice and his growing entitlement. They were the final step in making sure my home remained mine, no matter how loudly he argued or how confidently he claimed it. I signed them with a steady hand, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I understood that blood may shape a family, but responsibility shapes a legacy, and I refused to let entitlement rewrite mine. I started looking back at the small moments that built up to this day, and the more I remembered, the more everything made sense. My son had been showing signs of entitlement for years, but I kept brushing them aside, thinking he was stressed or tired or simply having a bad week. Now, standing in the middle of this situation with the property and the disrespect, I could finally see the pattern clearly. It had not begun today. It had begun slowly, quietly, with tiny dismissive actions, careless attitudes, and bold assumptions about my life and my home. I remembered the first time he brushed off my opinion about repairs in the house, telling me he would handle it later, then never doing anything. I ended up fixing it myself, but he acted like he was doing me a favor just by listening. Then there were the times he told me I shouldn't worry about the bills, as if I didn't understand my own money. He would walk in, open cabinets, rearrange things, and speak like he owned every inch of the space. I didn't want to argue, so I let him do it, thinking it would pass. It never did. Instead, every time I let something slide, he pushed a little harder. I remembered the little comments he made at family gatherings, small jabs that seemed harmless at first. When people complimented the house, he would smile and act as if he had designed it or paid for it. He acted like the decisions were his, even though he never lifted a finger to build anything. When I cooked, he would criticize the ingredients. When I cleaned, he would say I should hire someone. When I saved money, he would say I was being dramatic. Some days, it felt like he was waiting for me to fall apart so he could step in and take control. But I kept going, pretending not to notice. Then came the financial hints. At first, he suggested I should put his name on small documents for convenience. Later, he said it would be easier if future property decisions went through him. I said I would think about it. He assumed I meant yes. His confidence grew with every small win, and my quietness made him think I had no strength left. He believed he was the leader of the family now, not realizing he was only building a version of reality inside his own head. I also remembered the way he acted when other people praised me. He didn't like it. If someone complimented me for maintaining the house or managing things well, he would roll his eyes or change the subject. He never said it out loud, but his body language showed everything. He couldn't stand the thought of me being capable. He wanted me to depend on him so he could eventually take over. I kept ignoring it, telling myself families go through phases. But this wasn't a phase. It was behavior growing stronger every year. The disrespect became clearer when he started entering the house without asking. He would use his spare key, walk in whenever he wanted, and act like it was a casual visit. Sometimes he arrived early in the morning, sometimes at night. He never checked if I was sleeping, sick, or busy. He walked in, inspected the house, made comments, and stood there as if he was doing me a favor. I used to think it was because he cared. Now I understood it was because he wanted to measure the place like it already belonged to him. There were moments when he told people that one day this house will be mine. He laughed when he said it, but the confidence in his face was real. People looked confused, but he brushed it off. I stayed silent, not wanting drama, but deep inside, I felt a small sting every time he spoke like that. My own son, acting like he was waiting for me to disappear so he could take my years of work and sacrifice. I kept peace, not knowing it was giving him permission. Another memory came back, the time he questioned my choices about the garden. He walked around acting like he was sizing up land value, not appreciating the flowers I planted with love. He suggested removing old trees I cherished for decades. Every suggestion was about profit, control, or appearing in charge. Nothing was about respect or care. I should have seen the warning signs then, but I was a mother first, always hoping he would mature. Looking at everything now, each small sign built a clear picture. His arrogance didn't suddenly appear. It grew slowly from my silence. He learned that he could raise his voice, dismiss my opinions, walk into my home, and act like the owner. He learned that he could push boundaries, and I wouldn't push back. These tiny cracks in respect had turned into a deep break. And now, when he shrugged at me and said he didn't know what I meant, pretending the property papers were nothing, it became clear that he believed his version of reality completely. But he had no idea that all these little moments that showed his entitlement had pushed me to do something he would never see coming. He thought I had no strength left, no strategy, no voice. He thought I was weak. He was wrong. And the papers he pretended didn't exist were about to show him exactly who I really was. The days that followed were slow, heavy, and filled with a quiet kind of dread that only a mother can recognize. My son grew bolder, more careless, and strangely proud of the power he thought he had over me. Every word he spoke carried a new sharpness. Every step he took inside my home felt like a warning. He behaved as if the house already belonged to him, as if my presence inside these walls was temporary, almost inconvenient. He opened cabinets that weren't his, moved things without asking, and walked through the rooms like a man taking inventory. His confidence was not earned. It was born from entitlement and fed by the belief that I had nothing left to protect myself with. He acted like he owned every inch of the place, and I watched quietly, letting him think he was right. He made comments, small at first, comments about fixing things up once everything is transferred, comments about moving his family into the larger bedroom, comments about using the basement for his projects. He spoke as if decisions were already made, as if my signature was just a formality he was waiting for. And the worst part was that he never paused to see how his words landed, how they scraped against me like sandpaper. It was like watching someone erase you slowly with a smile on their face. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply acted like my life's work was waiting to be handed to him with a ribbon on top. Then the threats began. They were not loud and they were not direct. They were subtle, almost casual, dropped into everyday conversation like they didn't matter. He would say things like, "You don't want trouble at your age," or "It's better if you just let me handle things," or "I've talked to people who say this will be easier if you don't fight it." His voice stayed calm, but the meaning behind his words was sharp, cold, and cruel. He truly believed he could scare me into giving up the house, the land, the memories, the security I built with my own hands. And each time he said something like that, a quiet strength inside me grew stronger. I watched him walk around the kitchen one afternoon, opening drawers and closing them again, like he was planning renovations. He started measuring walls. He wrote notes in a little book he kept in his pocket. He even asked a contractor friend to come by, just to look. I stood there watching, and neither of them knew the truth. Neither of them knew that the house wasn't just mine emotionally. It was mine legally, locked, protected, untouchable. My signature was already on every document he believed didn't exist. While he wandered through the house dreaming of ownership, I already had every protection in place, and the more arrogant he became, the calmer I felt. One evening, he stood by the front door and said, "Once everything goes through, I'll probably change the locks." My hand didn't even shake. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I simply nodded, because there was nothing he could say that would touch me. He thought he held the cards. He thought he had leverage. He thought I was an old woman with no fight left in her. In his mind, he had already won. In his mind, this house was already slipping into his hands like sand. He didn't know I had already taken away his power months ago. He didn't know that I had signed the papers quietly, legally, and permanently. He didn't know that every threat he made only dug the hole deeper for him. His arrogance grew so large it filled the room. He invited people over without asking me. He corrected me in my own house. He told relatives that changes were coming soon. He suggested that I move into a small guest room for now so that he could prepare things. And every time he tried to push me, I held my silence. I held it because silence is a weapon when you know the truth. Silence is power when the other person thinks you have none. Silence is strength when the final blow is yours to deliver. Toward the end of the week, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You don't understand how this works. You don't own anything. I do." He said it with the confidence of a king, forgetting one important detail. Paperwork decides ownership, not pride. And I had every paper, every signature, every boundary fully protected. He had no idea that his threats meant nothing. He had no idea that his arrogance only made my victory sweeter. He had no idea that when the time came to reveal everything, his world would collapse in one quiet moment. And so I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. I let him believe every lie he told himself, because the louder he bragged, the harder the silence would hit him. When I think back to that moment, when my son stood in front of me acting like I had no rights, I remember something else rising inside me. Something stronger than anger, stronger than fear, and stronger than the years I spent being quiet for the sake of peace. It was the memory of the day I signed the property papers in my lawyer's office, months before this argument even started. I remembered the smell of the wooden desk, the calm voice of the attorney, the pen in my hand, and the weight that lifted from my chest when I saw my name printed clearly as the sole owner. That moment had given me control, even if I kept it hidden. And now, watching my son act like he owned everything, those papers felt like a shield I had been carrying quietly, waiting for the time when I needed to lift it. I stood there, letting him continue with his arrogance, his confidence, his belief that I was weak, that I was old, that I was someone he could push aside with a few sharp words. For years, he had gotten used to the idea that I would say nothing, argue nothing, and obey everything. He thought age meant surrender. But what he didn't know was that age teaches strategy, patience, and the value of keeping certain moves unseen until the right moment. He thought he was the one planning ahead, but he didn't realize that I had already put things in motion long before he ever tried to challenge me. I thought about how he dismissed my concerns in the past, how he shrugged whenever I talked about maintaining the house, how he treated me like I was just living in a place he already owned, like I was a temporary guest in a home I had built, cleaned, paid for, and protected for decades. He assumed control without earning it, and because he assumed it, he never paused to wonder if I had done something to secure my future. His entitlement blinded him. That gave me more power than any argument or raised voice ever could. Quiet planning became my strength. I remembered each meeting with my lawyer, each explanation about protecting myself, each detail about transferring ownership, each signature that made everything official. I had listened carefully, asked questions, and taken notes. I had done all of this alone because I wanted my decisions to be mine, not influenced by guilt or pressure. I remembered my lawyer telling me that secrecy was often protection, especially when dealing with family members who felt they were owed something they never worked for. I understood that message clearly. And now, watching my son puff his chest and claim what wasn't his, I realized how right my lawyer had been. Standing in my own living room, I could feel the papers almost burning in my memory, reminding me that everything he believed he controlled was actually secured behind my signature. And the best part was, he had no idea. He didn't know the fireproof safe that sat behind my bedroom dresser. He didn't know the coded lock. He didn't know about the sealed envelope inside it. He didn't know the attorney had digital copies stored. He didn't know that every document was protected legally and couldn't be touched, changed, or overturned without my approval. He didn't know any of it. He only knew the version of me he had created in his mind. Soft, easy to push, dependent, unaware. That version no longer existed. While he spoke about plans he had for the property, about ideas he wanted to pursue, about renovations he imagined, about authority he believed he had, I simply let him keep talking. Each word he said only reminded me that revealing the truth later would be far more impactful. Letting him underestimate me was an advantage I wasn't going to waste. Silence became my strategy, calm became my armor, and patience became my revenge. In that moment, I realized something even deeper. My son didn't only want the property, he wanted control over me, and property was just the first step. That thought was painful, but it also gave me clarity I had avoided for too long. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't poor communication. This was disrespect built over years, taking shape in front of me. and the only thing standing between his control and my freedom were the papers he didn't know I had already signed. While he spoke, I felt a strange sense of peace inside me, not happiness, not satisfaction, just calm certainty. I understood exactly what needed to happen next. The real power was already in my hands. The only thing left was the timing. And I had all the time in the world. I knew the moment had come for me to stop depending on chance and start protecting myself with clear steps. Sitting alone in my quiet living room, I thought about everything that had happened and how my son had treated me, and it was obvious that hoping he would come to his senses would be nothing more than a waste of time. His arrogance had grown too strong, and his belief that I was weak had grown even stronger. That belief was something I could use, but only if I acted with care. So I reached for the small notebook I kept in the drawer near my chair, the one where I wrote down important phone numbers, documents I needed, and reminders I didn't want anyone else to see. In that notebook was the name of the lawyer who had handled the signing of the property papers. I had chosen someone who believed in privacy, someone who never shared what he didn't need to share. That was why my son had no idea those papers even existed, and that secrecy was exactly what I needed now. I called him slowly, letting the phone ring as I prepared myself for what I knew would be a long conversation. When he answered, I explained everything calmly, step by step, without adding emotion. I told him what my son had said, what he had implied, and the way he had acted as if he had the power to take the property from me. I didn't need to exaggerate anything. The truth alone was enough to make anyone understand the danger. My lawyer listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he spoke in a steady voice that reminded me why I trusted him. He said the papers I had signed were strong and clear. He said my ownership was protected fully. He also said that many people, especially adult children, believed they could push their aging parents into giving up property simply because they felt entitled to it. He called it the new kind of family manipulation, and that phrase stayed with me more than I expected. We spoke for almost an hour, going over every detail, every option, every document that might ever be needed. By the time we finished, I felt a kind of strength in my hands that I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not fear, just control. True, solid control. He told me he would prepare copies of all the signed papers with certified stamps, and I should keep them in multiple safe places. He said he would also be available if things escalated again, and that he could be present for any confrontation if my son ever tried to argue ownership. When we hung up, I sat there for a few minutes, letting the reality sink in. I wasn't vulnerable. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't at risk of losing anything. My son only believed those things because that was the version of me he wanted to see. An older woman who needed guidance, someone he thought he could control with a raised voice and dismissive attitude. After gathering my thoughts, I reached out to an old friend, someone who had seen me through harder moments in life, someone who had watched me raise my children, bury family members, and work through loss without asking for applause from anyone. I trusted her more than most people. She came over in the evening, sat across from me, and listened to the entire story. I didn't speak with drama. I spoke with facts. I didn't complain. I explained. She didn't gasp or scold or tell me what I should have done. She simply nodded, took my hands, and reminded me that quiet strength was still strength, and sometimes the most powerful moves were the ones made without noise. She helped me gather everything I needed into a thick folder. Copies of the deed, the recorded transfer documents, the lawyer's letter, even notes about the conversations I had endured with my son. She said that documentation was not only for legal protection, but also for mental clarity. When everything is written down and organized, it becomes impossible for anyone, especially manipulative family members, to twist the truth. And she was right. Looking at that folder, I felt grounded, settled, prepared. Before she left, she told me that standing up to your own child is one of the hardest things a parent can do, but sometimes it is also the most necessary. She said I was doing the right thing, not just for myself, but for the dignity I deserved after years of sacrifice, discipline, and hard work. Her words did not make me feel proud. They made me feel steady, firm, ready. By the end of the night, I had everything in order. I had legal backup, emotional support, clear documentation, and a plan. My son believed he held all the power, but he had no idea what I had built behind the scenes. And as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, one thought stayed with me. Sometimes the strongest revenge is not loud, angry, or dramatic. Sometimes it is simply being prepared and letting the truth speak louder than anyone's arrogance. When the moment finally came to confront my son, I felt no fear, no shaking, no weakness left in my body. I had spent months preparing myself for this day. I had collected every paper, every signature, every document that proved the property was fully mine. I had worked quietly and patiently to make sure he had no opening left to twist the truth, no window left to challenge my rights, and no space left to stand over me the way he had always tried. I woke that morning with a clear mind and walked around the house, touching each wall, each window frame, each little piece of my life that had taken decades to build. I told myself that if I wanted to protect this place, this was the day I finally had to stand firm. After breakfast, I placed all the documents in a plain folder, closed it tight, and waited at the dining table, knowing he would show up as he did every week, acting as if everything belonged to him. His car arrived like it always did, loud, careless, and full of arrogance. The moment he stepped inside, he carried himself with the same confidence he always had, as if he owned the air in the house, the chairs in the room, and even the ground he walked on. He talked over me without listening. He gestured widely like the place was already his, and he gave that familiar dismissive smirk that had irritated me for years. He believed I was powerless, and that belief had made him reckless. When he finally sat down, I placed the folder on the table between us. The air shifted slightly, but he didn't notice. He continued talking, explaining what he thought should happen, how he planned to use the house, and how little authority he believed I had left. In that moment, I realized just how far he had drifted from the values I had tried to teach him. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't argue. I simply waited for him to take a breath. When he finally paused, I pushed the folder gently toward him. There was no emotion in his face at first. He looked at it like it was nothing important. Then he opened it. I watched his eyes freeze as the first page hit him harder than any words I could have spoken. His smirk faded slowly, almost painfully, like someone was pulling the expression off his face piece by piece. He stared at the signatures, the dates, the seals, the confirmation letters, the transfer agreements, the recorded ownership filings, everything done months before he ever tried to challenge me. The silence grew so heavy, it felt like the entire house was listening. His breathing changed, turning shallow and uneven. He flipped through the pages faster, hoping to find a mistake, a loophole, a missing stamp, anything that could prove I was wrong. But the more he turned the pages, the paler he became. Every sheet reminded him that he had underestimated me, that while he was busy plotting and assuming, I had been making moves he never imagined. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He was too shocked to speak. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to argue. The papers spoke louder than anything I could have said. For the first time in years, he looked at me without arrogance, without superiority, without that careless disrespect he often used to hide his own insecurity. He looked smaller, almost defeated. I explained nothing. I repeated nothing. I simply told him, in calm and steady words, that the house was mine, legally, fully, and permanently. I stated the boundaries without hesitation. I told him that he would not pressure me again, that he would not claim anything that wasn't his, and that if he attempted any further manipulation, I was ready to take legal action without another warning. There was no anger in my voice, only strength. The more I spoke, the more he shrank back in his chair, finally understanding that I wasn't the fragile woman he thought he could control. When I finished, the room went silent again. He looked at the folder once more, but the fight had already left him. I picked up the papers, closed the folder, and stood up. The ultimatum was clear. The control he believed he had was gone. The house remained mine, and now he knew I was not someone he could dismiss or manipulate again. The confrontation was over, and I had won without raising a single hand or voice. When the truth finally came out and every document was placed on the table, the room changed in a way I will never forget. The air became heavy, almost stiff, like the walls were holding their breath. My son stood there, staring at the papers with wide eyes that slowly narrowed as the truth settled in. For months he had believed he was in control. For months he had acted like the house, the land, and every decision connected to it belonged to him. He assumed I would bend, break, or simply give up because he felt stronger, younger, louder. But now he stood speechless as the reality he had built in his mind collapsed in front of him. He realized that everything he planned so confidently had no ground to stand on. The property was legally mine, every inch of it, signed, stamped, protected, and secured in a way he never expected. In that moment, something inside him shifted. I saw it in the way he dropped his shoulders, in the way his hands trembled, in the way he looked around the room, as if trying to find support that wasn't there. He had always believed he held the upper hand because he thought age made me weak, slow, and easy to mislead. But age had only made me careful, thoughtful, and wiser than he had ever imagined. As he read through each page, the weight of his arrogance pressed down on him. He understood that all his threats, his dismissive attitude, his cold words, and his attempts to push me aside now meant nothing. He had overplayed his hand and lost. I did not raise my voice. I did not celebrate. I simply stood there and watched the truth settle like dust over everything we once shared. It hurt more than I expected. Winning did not feel like victory. It felt like the end of something that had already been dying for a long time. My son's behavior had pushed me to protect what I built, what I saved, and what I fought for. But seeing him so shocked, so lost, reminded me of the little boy he once was, running to me with scraped knees, asking me to make everything better. Now he was a grown man standing in the wreckage of his own decisions, and I could not fix what greed had broken inside him. The consequence of the moment was not just legal, it was emotional. It built a wall between us that no apology could tear down easily. He did not speak for a while. He only stared at the papers, the ones he had pretended didn't exist, the ones he dismissed so confidently, the ones he assumed were irrelevant, the ones that now dictated his reality. After minutes of silence, he finally stepped back, unable to look at me. He realized he had to leave because he no longer had ground to stand on. He packed his pride and walked toward the door slowly, each step heavy, each breath sharp, each moment filled with the understanding that he could no longer claim what wasn't his. As the door closed behind him, the entire house felt different. For years, I feared losing control over my own property. For years, I worried that age would weaken my voice. For years, I stayed quiet to keep peace, even when I saw signs of disrespect. But that moment reminded me that silence can protect peace only for so long. There comes a time when a person has to stand up and say enough, and that time had finally come for me. In the days that followed, my son distanced himself. He avoided calls, avoided visits, and avoided facing the truth that he had forced me into a corner I never wanted to stand in. But I did not chase him. I did not beg him to come back. I did not reach out to soften the blow. Some lessons must be learned without comfort. Some consequences must be carried without support. And some scars must be felt, not covered. I continued living in my home with a renewed sense of peace. Every room felt like a victory, not over him, but over fear, over manipulation, over disrespect. I kept the papers in a safe place, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as a reminder that strength does not always come from youth. Sometimes it comes from patience, preparation, and quiet courage. My home remained mine, not because I fought loud, but because I prepared wisely. The consequence for him was loss of control. The consequence for me was the return of peace. And while the situation broke something between us, it also rebuilt something inside me. The understanding that protecting myself is not betrayal, it is survival. When everything finally settled and the papers were back in my drawer where they belonged, I sat alone in my living room and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket I hadn't felt in years. The property was safe, fully in my name, protected in ways my son had never imagined. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight on my chest loosen, like a knot slowly untying itself after decades of being pulled tight. But winning didn't feel like victory, not right away. It felt like waking up from a long, exhausting dream where I had been walking uphill with everyone pushing against me. I realized I had spent years allowing small disrespect, thinking it was normal, thinking it was family, thinking love meant silence and sacrifice. But this final moment, him saying he didn't know what I meant, pretending I had no power, opened my eyes wider than anything else ever had. I thought about everything I had done for him, all the meals cooked, bills paid, nights stayed up when he was sick, days spent helping him fix his mistakes. I wasn't angry about the sacrifices. Those were part of motherhood. But I was angry at how easy it had become for him to expect things from me, as if they were his right, not my choice. Somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing me as a person with rights and dreams of my own. He started seeing me as someone he could talk down to, someone who would never push back, someone he assumed would always fold under pressure. That realization hurt deeper than the property fight itself. But sitting there, with the documents that proved my independence, something shifted inside me. I saw that protecting myself wasn't betrayal, it was self-respect. For years, I believed that being a mother meant giving, and giving more, even when I was empty. But motherhood shouldn't mean surrendering your dignity. It shouldn't mean letting your own child treat you as if you don't matter. The security papers in my hand reminded me that I had taken control not to hurt him, but to protect the life I built with my own sweat and patience. I realized I had been waiting far too long for gratitude that was never going to come. Days passed, and he stayed quiet. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he finally understood the limits he had crossed. Or maybe he didn't understand anything at all. Sometimes silence is its own confession. But I didn't chase him. I didn't call. I didn't apologize for something I had every right to do. I simply lived my days peacefully, reminding myself that boundaries aren't punishments, they're protections. I started taking walks again, cooking meals for myself instead of rushing to cook for others, sitting outside on my porch in the evenings with a cup of tea and a blanket. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly anticipating confrontation or criticism. I wasn't waiting for a phone call asking for money, for favors, for handouts masked as responsibilities. I was living for myself, not for someone else's entitlement. And it felt strangely new, like learning to breathe fresh air after living in a closed room for too long. Eventually, he showed up again, not at my door, but in my messages. Short words, careful words, the kind people use when they know they've gone too far but aren't ready to say it outright. I didn't reply with anger. I didn't reply with sweetness either. I replied with clarity, firmness, and strength, the same strength that helped me sign those papers months ago. I told him I loved him, but I would never allow disrespect again. I told him my life was mine, my property was mine, and my peace was not something I would negotiate. I told him that love doesn't mean power, it means respect. And if he wanted a relationship with me, it had to begin with that. Whether he will change or not, I don't know. Change is slow. Sometimes it takes a whole lifetime. But I do know this. He will never again assume I am powerless. He will never again speak to me like I am invisible. And if he tries, he will find a mother who has already learned how to protect herself. The truth is, signing those papers wasn't just about property. It was about reclaiming the part of myself I had lost along the way. A part that believed I deserved fairness. A part that believed I deserved respect. A part that believed age doesn't erase your rights. That moment taught me something I wish I learned years ago. Love your children deeply, but love yourself enough to stand firm. Family can hurt you, but it can also teach you the strongest lessons. And the strongest lesson I learned was this: silence doesn't keep peace, boundaries do.